In commercial aviation, the line between a routine landing and a mass casualty event is measured in millimeters. Most passengers think it's the pilots who keep them alive. They don't realize their lives actually rest in the hands of the mechanics standing under harsh fluorescent lights at 3 in the morning, looking for a crack in a titanium blade no thicker than a single human hair. The hangar was a cavern of echoing metal, smelling sharply of synthetic hydraulic fluid and the lingering, kerosene-heavy scent of jet fuel. At 56 years old, my knees popping with every squat and bend, I had spent more than 3 decades walking these polished concrete floors. I knew the anatomy of a commercial airliner better than my own. Above me loomed Ship 402, a massive twin-engine, wide-body jet, its cowlings stripped back to expose the intricate metallic heart of its left-side turbofan. I held a high-intensity flashlight in one hand and a magnifying loupe in the other. I was deep inside the bypass duct, examining the high-pressure turbine, the HPT. This was the section of the engine that endured the most punishing environment imaginable, spinning at thousands of revolutions per minute while bathed in temperatures that could melt ordinary steel. "You're squinting at shadows, Henry," a voice called up from the floor. I didn't need to look down to know it was Elijah Hayes. Elijah was 28, fresh out of an accelerated engineering management program and currently assigned as my trainee. He wore a pristine, unsmudged uniform and carried a sleek tablet that held all the digital manuals. He treated aircraft like they were software programs, something to be debugged, rebooted, and pushed out the door. He didn't feel the metal. He didn't respect the physics. "Bring me the borescope, Elijah," I said, my voice echoing slightly inside the cowling. "And tell Elias to get over here." I heard an exasperated sigh, followed by the squeak of Elijah's immaculate boots. A moment later, Elias Bell, a veteran floor mechanic who had been turning wrenches with me since the late 90s, handed up the flexible optic line of the borescope. "What do you see, Henry?" Elias asked, his gravelly voice tight with immediate professional concern. "Look at the root of blade number 14 on the first stage," I said, sliding out so Elias could take a look at the monitor. Elijah leaned in over Elias's shoulder, tapping his stylus against his tablet. "The digital diagnostic ran clean an hour ago. Thrust metrics from the last flight were perfectly within normal parameters. It's carbon scoring, just a surface scratch." "Metals don't lie, Elijah," I said, keeping my voice dangerously level. "Digital sensors only tell you what the computer is programmed to see. The computer can't see metal fatigue." Elias adjusted the dial on the borescope, zooming the camera in on the base of the titanium blade. The image on the screen crystallized. There, running right along the stress-bearing root of the blade, was a jagged, hairline shadow. It was less than 3 millimeters long, entirely invisible to the naked eye without the right light and angle. "Mother of God," Elias muttered, rubbing his jaw. "That's a microfracture." "It's a shadow from the LED," Elijah insisted, pointing at the screen. "You're holding up a turnaround for a shadow. The plane is scheduled for Tokyo at 6 this evening. We sign it off, it flies. We make the dispatch reliability metric. We ground it, and we blow the quarters on time rating." I climbed down the scaffolding, wiping a smudge of grease from my hands with a red rag. I stood face to face with Elijah. He was taller than me, but he instinctively took a half step back. "That is a stress fracture, Elijah," I said, tapping a heavy finger against the monitor. "If that engine spools up to take off thrust, the centrifugal force will pull that crack wide open. The blade will snap. When it snaps, it will become a piece of shrapnel traveling at the speed of a bullet inside an aluminum tube filled with highly combustible fuel. It will tear through the engine casing, through the wing, and potentially into the passenger cabin." Elijah crossed his arms, his jaw tightening. "That's worst-case scenario fear-mongering. The manuals say a surface anomaly under 5 millimeters. I don't care what your tablet says," I cut him off. "That engine is dead. It doesn't fly. Word of a grounded, wide body travels faster than a fire alarm in corporate aviation." Less than 20 minutes after I had made the call, the heavy metal doors of the hangar office swung open, and Owen Miller walked onto the floor. Miller was 45, the vice president of operations, and a man who looked at airplanes and saw nothing but flying spreadsheets. He wore a sharp, tailored suit that looked entirely alien against the industrial backdrop of toolboxes and engine hoists. He didn't walk. He marched, driven entirely by quarterly metrics and his own relentless ambition to reach the board of directors. "Henry!" Miller snapped as he approached the scaffolding. "I'm told you're trying to park Ship 402. "I'm not trying to do anything, Owen," I replied, wiping my hands again. "The engine made the decision for us. First stage HPT blade has a stress fracture at the root. It requires a full teardown and an engine swap." Miller's face flushed a deep, angry crimson. "An engine swap? Do you have any idea what you're saying? That takes 48 hours minimum. We have 350 passengers checking in for Tokyo in 5 hours. A grounded wide-body costs this airline $80,000 an hour in lost revenue and compensation, not to mention the hit to our dispatch reliability. A crashed wide-body costs a lot more than that, I said evenly. It costs lives. The engine is structurally compromised. Show me, Miller demanded. I gestured to the borescope monitor, where the crack was still frozen on the screen. Miller leaned in, staring at it for a few seconds. He didn't have an engineering degree. To him, it was just a squiggly line on a dark screen. It's microscopic, Miller scoffed, standing up straight and adjusting his cuffs. I can barely even see it on a zoomed-in camera. You're telling me a millimeter scratch is going to bring down a $150 million aircraft? Yes, I said, that is exactly what I am telling you. It's a fatigue fracture. Elias stood a few feet away, arms crossed, nodding his agreement. But Elijah stepped forward, his tablet glowing softly in the dim light of the hangar. Mr. Miller, if I may, Elijah said, his tone dripping with the kind of corporate deference that made my stomach turn. Miller looked at him, eager for any voice that would give him the answer he wanted. Go ahead, Hayes. I've been reviewing the manufacturer's tolerances, Elijah said smoothly, tapping his screen. While Henry is technically correct that a teardown is the most conservative approach, there is an alternate protocol. We can perform a localized blend, essentially polishing out the surface anomaly, and run a high-power run-up diagnostic. If the sensors come back green, we can authorize a one-time ferry flight, or, with an executive variance, clear it for revenue service. I stared at my trainee, appalled. A localized blend? You can't polish out a crack that goes into the root of the titanium, Elijah. That's not engineering. That's hiding the evidence. It's optimization, Elijah shot back, his eyes flashing with defiance. It's balancing risk tolerance with operational necessity. You're stuck in the old way of doing things, Henry. The new metals, the new sensors, they can handle more than you think. Miller looked between the two of us. He saw an aging mechanic who was costing him money and a bright, ambitious young engineer who was offering him a lifeline. The power dynamic in the room shifted instantly. Hayes makes a compelling point, Miller said slowly, a predatory smile forming on his face. We are in the business of flying airplanes, Henry, not parking them indefinitely because you're paranoid about a shadow. I am the senior licensed technician on this floor, I said, my voice hardening into stone. I am telling you, as a matter of physics and law, that plane does not fly. Miller's smile vanished. We'll see about that. I didn't wait to see what Miller and Elijah would whisper about in the supervisor's office. I knew exactly what they were attempting to do. They wanted to find a loophole, a second opinion, or a gray area in the regulations that would allow them to push ship 402 out of the hangar and onto the runway. I walked straight to the secure lockbox at the center of the maintenance floor. Elias walked quietly in step behind me, a silent vanguard. I unlocked the heavy steel door of the box and pulled out a physical red tag. In the world of aviation maintenance, the red tag is sacred. It is a bright crimson piece of heavy cardstock with a wire tie. Once a licensed airframe and power plant A&P mechanic fills it out and attaches it to an aircraft component, it is legally grounded by the Federal Aviation Administration under Part 121 regulations. Removing a red tag without resolving the mechanical failure and without the sign-off of the mechanic who placed is a federal crime. I took out my pen and began writing. I documented the date, the time, the exact location of the microfracture on the HPT blade, and my signature. I then walked to the digital terminal and entered the exact same information into the airline's unfalsifiable maintenance mainframe, permanently linking the grounding order to my personal license number. You're painting a target on your own back, Henry, Elias said softly as I finished typing. Miller is going to come for your head. Let him, I said, pulling the tag from the desk. I walked back over to ship 402. I climbed the rolling stairs up to the cockpit. The plane was dark, powered down, silent. I walked into the flight deck, the familiar array of glass screens and switches surrounding me. I reached the center console, took the red tag, and wired it directly and tightly around the massive throttle levers for the left engine. I locked it in place. The engine was dead. When I walked back down the stairs, Miller and Elijah were waiting at the bottom. Miller looked at the red tag visible through the cockpit window, and his face contorted with absolute fury. "What did you just do?" Miller hissed, his voice echoing in the quiet hangar. "I did my job," I said, staring him down. "The engine is red tagged. The flight is scrubbed. You need to call operations and tell them to start rebooking passengers. Miller stepped into my space, his chest puffed out, trying to use his corporate authority to intimidate a man who had been working heavy machinery since before Miller was in high school. You do not have the authority to unilaterally cancel a Tokyo heavy route, Miller spat. I am ordering you to go up there, remove that tag, and initiate Hayes's blending protocol. Now! No, I said simply. It's insubordination, Henry, Elijah chimed in, standing safely behind Miller's shoulder. You're refusing a direct operational directive from the VP. I shifted my gaze to Elijah, and for the first time, I didn't see a trainee who needed guidance. I saw a dangerous liability. I'm refusing an illegal order to pencil whip a compromised turbine, Elijah. If you ever want to actually earn your license, I suggest you learn the difference. Miller pointed a trembling finger at my chest. Remove the tag, Brown, or you are finished here. I looked down at his finger, then up into his furious eyes. The tag stays. Physics doesn't care about your quarterly bonus, Owen. The plane stays on the ground. The heavy silence of the hangar pressed down on us, broken only by the distant, high-pitched whine of a jet taxiing on the runway outside. The battle lines were drawn in permanent ink. The supervisor's office was a glass-walled box suspended 10 feet above the hangar floor, designed so management could look down on the mechanics. For the next hour, I didn't look up. I stayed by ship 402 with Elias, running secondary diagnostics on the right engine, though my mind was entirely focused on the red tag secured in the cockpit. Through the reflection of the polished aluminum cowling, I could see the movement in the glass office above. Miller was pacing, phone pressed to his ear, waving his free hand in sharp, erratic gestures. Elijah sat at the supervisor's desk, his tablet glowing, typing rapidly. They weren't calling operations to cancel the flight. They were looking for a loophole. 45 minutes later, the PA system crackled. Henry Brown, report to the elevated office. Elias put down his wrench. He looked at me, his weathered face lined with grim certainty. Don't let them bully you, Henry. They can't bully physics, Elias, I replied, wiping my hands and heading for the metal stairs. When I opened the door to the office, the air conditioning hit me like a wall of ice. Miller was standing behind the desk, arms crossed. Elijah was seated, refusing to meet my eyes, staring intently at a freshly printed stack of documents. We found a resolution, Miller said, his voice clipped and dripping with artificial authority. Under Section 8 of the Corporate Maintenance Manual, in the event of an operational dispute between a senior technician and management, the VP of Operations can authorize a transfer of primary diagnostic responsibility to another licensed A&P mechanic. I stared at him, the sheer audacity of the maneuver settling into my bones. You're taking me off the aircraft. I am reassigning you, Miller corrected smoothly. Effective immediately, Elijah is the lead technician on Ship 402. He has reviewed the manufacturer's variance guidelines and has determined that a localized cosmetic blend is sufficient to return the engine to service. I looked at my trainee. You're going to sign off on this, Elijah. You're going to put your stamp on a fractured turbine blade? Elijah finally looked up, his jaw set in a stubborn, defensive line. I'm optimizing the workflow, Henry. I ran the stress models on my tablet. The fracture is within the acceptable safety margin for a single ferry flight, and the executive variance clears it for revenue service. It's a calculated, data-driven decision. You're just too stubborn to see the big picture. The big picture is 350 people sitting over a wing full of jet fuel, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You can't polish out a root fracture, Elijah. You are just hiding the crack under a smooth surface. When it experiences the thermal expansion of takeoff, it will snap. I have my A&P license, Henry, Elijah said, his voice rising, defensive and arrogant. My signature is just as valid as yours. Your signature is ink, I fired back. Ink doesn't hold titanium together at 30,000 feet. Miller slammed his hand flat on the desk. Enough. The decision is made. Hayes is taking over. You are to hand over the physical keys to the lockout tags, and you are to step down from the aircraft. I will not remove that red tag, I said, holding Miller's gaze. And if Elijah cuts it without replacing the blade, I am calling the FAA hotline the second I walk out of this room. Miller smiled a cold, reptilian expression. I thought you might say that. He slid a manila envelope across the desk, which is why you aren't walking out of this room as an employee. You are being terminated, Henry. Effective immediately. Cause gross insubordination and interfering with airline operations. The walk to the locker room felt like a funeral march. 2 corporate security guards in cheap blazers escorted me down the metal stairs, shadowing my every step. The hangar had gone deathly quiet. Every mechanic, every avionics tech, every floor sweeper had stopped what they were doing to watch. I didn't rush. I walked to my heavy rolling toolbox, a scarred steel behemoth I had owned for 25 years, and began packing my personal micrometers, my specialized torque wrenches, and the custom grips I had molded to my own hands. Each click of a tool sliding into its foam cutout echoed in the silent locker room. Elias stepped out from the row of lockers. The security guards tensed, but I held up a hand to stop them. Elias looked at my open box, then up at me. His eyes were bright with unshed anger. "He's actually doing it, Henry." Elijah took a Dremel tool up to the cowling. "He's blending the blade right now. He's just grinding the surface smooth." My stomach turned to lead. "It'll fail, Elias. It's not a question of if, but when. Keep your head down, but document everything you see. Write it in your personal notebook. Don't trust the mainframe. Miller will try to scrub my data." "I've got it," Elias whispered. I locked my heavy box and handed the padlock key to Elias. "Keep this safe for me. I'll send a truck for it tomorrow." I turned and walked back out onto the main floor, carrying only a small cardboard box with my framed certificates, my coffee thermos, and my heavily annotated copy of the FAA rulebook. As I reached the main blast doors, Miller and Elijah were standing there watching me leave. Elijah looked incredibly smug, a young man who thought he had just slain the dragon and taken the castle. I stopped 2 feet away from them. The security guards flanked me, but I ignored them. "I've left the digital logs intact," I said softly, looking directly into Elijah's eyes. "My initial diagnostic is hard-coded into the mainframe. When that engine shreds itself, they are going to look for the last man to touch it. A piece of paper doesn't change the tensile strength of metal, Elijah. When it snaps, it's your signature on the blood." Elijah swallowed hard, the first flicker of genuine doubt crossing his face, but Miller stepped forward, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. "Escort Mr. Mather Brown off the property," Miller told the guards. "He's no longer our problem." I didn't go home. I couldn't. Instead, I drove my truck to the airport's perimeter road, parking on a stretch of gravel that overlooked the international terminal. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, bruised shadows of purple and orange across the concrete expanse of the tarmac. I sat in the driver's seat, the engine idling to keep the heater running, and pulled up the airline's flight tracker app on my phone. Flight 118. Heavy, service to Tokyo. NRT status, boarding, gate 42. Aircraft, ship 402. My phone buzzed in the cuff holder. It was a text from Elias. "Tag cut. Engine closed up." Miller signed the executive release. "It's pushing back in 20 minutes. I gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I could feel my heart hammering against my ribs, a heavy, sick rhythm of pure dread. In my mind's eye, I wasn't in my truck. I was inside the casing of that left engine. I could see the microscopic fault line hiding just beneath the newly polished surface of the turbine blade. It was a structural cancer, waiting for the extreme heat and centrifugal stress of takeoff for us to tear it apart. Through the chain link fence about a half-mile away, I saw the massive tail fin of ship 402 slowly backing away from gate 42. The flashing orange lights of the tug illuminated the aircraft's belly. They had done it. Elijah had signed the release forms, blinded by the promise of my job and Miller's praise. Miller had pushed it through, blinded by his dispatch reliability metrics and his unquenchable greed. Between them, they had authorized 350 passengers to buckle themselves into a flying bomb. I picked up my phone and dialed the FAA Emergency Aviation Safety Hotline. I had already decided to make the call, but as the automated voice prompted me to hold for the next available federal inspector, I knew the bitter truth. Bureaucracy moves in days and weeks. An airplane moves in minutes. Through the windshield, I watched ship 402 detach from the tug. The beacon lights on the top and bottom of the fuselage began to flash a steady, rhythmic red. The engines were starting. Even from this distance, through the rolled-up windows of my truck, I could hear the low, bass-heavy rumble as the massive turbofans began to ingest air. First, the right engine. Then, the left. I held the phone to my ear, listening to the hold music, my eyes locked on the left wing of the aircraft as it began its slow, heavy taxi toward runway 27 right. The dread in my stomach condensed into a cold, hard knot. The ticking clock had started, and there was absolutely nothing I could do but watch. The sun had fully dipped below the horizon, replacing the bruised sky with a deep, encroaching twilight. The runway lights of 27 right flared to life, 2 parallel lines of stark white pearls cutting across the darkening tarmac. Ship 402 lumbered to the threshold of the runway and stopped. It sat there, a massive, heavy silhouette, holding short. Inside the cockpit, I knew exactly what the pilots were doing. They were running through their final pre-takeoff checklists, confirming flaps, checking trim, completely unaware that the left engine they were about to push to maximum power was fundamentally compromised. On the other end of the line, the FAA hotline hold music finally clicked over to a live operator. Federal Aviation Administration, Safety Hotline. Inspector Davis speaking. Is this an emergency? Yes, I said, my voice tight. My name is Henry Brown, A&P license number 4821. I am reporting an unauthorized release of a critically compromised aircraft. Ship 402, heavy twin engine, currently holding short of runway 27 right. Hold on, Mr. Brown, the inspector said, the typing on his end frantic. What is the nature of the compromise? Stress fracture at the root of a first-stage high-pressure turbine blade on the left engine. The airline bypassed a red tag, performed a cosmetic blend, and released it for revenue service. There was a half-second of stunned silence on the line. Are you saying a fractured HPT blade is about to go to takeoff thrust? Yes, I said. My eyes locked on the silhouette of the jet. You need to call the tower right now and revoke their takeoff clearance. Right now. Through the windshield, I saw the strobe lights on the wingtips of Ship 402 begin to flash with violent intensity, the universal signal that an aircraft has been cleared onto the active runway. The massive jet slowly pivoted, lining up perfectly between the parallel white lights. It stopped again. The pilots were holding the brakes, and then the sound hit me, even a half-mile away, inside my truck. The low rumble of the engines deepened into a terrifying, visceral roar. The pilots were spooling up the engines while holding the brakes, letting the thrust build before releasing the aircraft. It's a standard procedure for a heavy jet, but to me, it was the sound of a bomb arming itself. In my mind, I was inside the cowling again. I could see the polished titanium blade. As the N1 fan speed increased, the internal temperature skyrocketed past 1,000 degrees. The centrifugal force pulling on that single blade multiplied exponentially. The microscopic crack hidden beneath Elijah's cosmetic polish was no longer a shadow. Under the immense stress of takeoff thrust, it was tearing open, micromillimeter by micromillimeter. Tower is not responding immediately, Mr. Tower. Brown, they are managing active traffic. The inspector's voice crackled urgently through my phone. I'm pushing an emergency abort order through the Tricon supervisor, but it takes time. They don't have time, I whispered, the roar of the engines vibrating through the floorboards of my truck. The brakes released. Ship 402 surged forward. The massive aircraft accelerated down the runway, a heavy beast fighting gravity. 80 knots, 100 knots, 120. The nose gear strut extended slightly as the aerodynamic lift began to take hold. They were approaching V1, the speed of no return. Once an aircraft passes V1, the pilots must commit to the takeoff, even if an engine fails, because there isn't enough runway left to stop. They were seconds away from lifting into the air. Crack. It wasn't a sound. It was a physical concussion that I felt in my chest before I heard it. Through the windshield, in the darkening twilight, a brilliant, terrifying flash of orange fire erupted from the left engine of Ship 402. It wasn't a controlled burn, it was an explosion. The sound reached me a second later, a deafening, metallic scream, like a freight train derailing inside a steel tunnel, followed immediately by a concussive boom that rattled the windows of my truck. The titanium blade had snapped. Traveling at near supersonic speed inside the casing, the shattered blade acted like a shrapnel grenade. It tore through the adjacent blades, instantly unbalancing the massive turbofan spinning at thousands of RPMs. The engine tore itself apart from the inside out. Sparks showered onto the runway in a blinding waterfall as the internal components shredded the Kevlar containment ring. It failed! I yelled into the phone, my heart slamming against my ribs. Left engine catastrophic uncontained failure. They're aborting. On the runway, chaos reigned. The pilots, acting on pure instinct and simulator training, immediately chopped the throttles and slammed on the heavy carbon brakes. The thrust reverser on the good right engine screamed as it deployed, trying to drag the massive aircraft to a halt. The left engine was a trailing comet of fire and sparks. The tires smoked, screaming against the concrete. The aircraft shuddered violently, veering slightly toward the grass before the pilot forced it back to the center line. It was a race between momentum and runway. I held my breath, my hands gripping the steering wheel so hard my fingers went numb. If they ran out of concrete, the heavy landing gear would dig into the soft earth, the struts would collapse, and the wings full of thousands of gallons of jet fuel would snap. The plane decelerated, the terrifying screech of the brakes echoing across the airfield. It rolled past the 1,000-foot markers, then the 500-foot markers. Finally, with less than 200 feet of pavement remaining, Ship 402 shuddered to a violent, smoking halt. For a terrible, stretched-out second, there was silence. Then, the emergency evacuation slides deployed from the fuselage with loud, explosive pops. The red strobe lights of the emergency fire trucks began pouring out from the airport fire stations, racing toward the smoking, crippled jet. I slowly lowered my phone from my ear. My hands were shaking uncontrollably. They hadn't reached V1. They hadn't left the ground. 350 people were sliding down the chutes into the grass, terrified but alive. If Elijah's polished blade had held together for just 10 more seconds, they would have been 300 feet in the air when the engine exploded. It would have torn the wing apart. They all would have died. The ticking clock had stopped. The reckoning had begun. By sunrise, the airport was a fortress of flashing lights, yellow tape, and federal authority. The National Transportation Safety Board, NTSB, and the FAA had descended on the tarmac like a swarm of angry hornets. Ship 402 sat exactly where it had stopped, the left engine a charred, gaping wound of twisted metal. I was not in my truck anymore. I was sitting in a sterile, windowless conference room in the regional FAA field office. 2 federal investigators, looking exhausted and deeply unamused, sat across the table from me. "Let's review this one more time, Mr. Brown," the lead investigator, a woman named Vance, said, tapping a silver pen against a thick file. "You state that you identified a microfracture at the root of a first-stage HPT blade on Ship 402. "I did," I replied, my voice hoarse but steady. "I red-tagged the engine. I logged it in the mainframe under my license number. And management removed you from the aircraft. Owen Miller, VP of Operations, removed me," I clarified. "He transferred primary diagnostic authority to a trainee named Elijah Hayes. Hayes performed a cosmetic blend to hide the stress fracture, and Miller signed the executive release for revenue service." Vance exchanged a look with her partner. "Mr. Brown, you understand the gravity of these accusations. You're alleging criminal negligence and the intentional bypass of federal safety mandates." "I don't have to allege anything," I said, leaning forward. "Pull the server logs. They fired me and escorted me out of the building. But before I left, I hard-coded my diagnostic report into the airline's maintenance mainframe. Unless Miller managed to hire a hacker to scrub an encrypted aviation server in the last 12 hours, the evidence is sitting right there." Vance's partner opened a laptop, typing rapidly. The room was silent for 3 long minutes. "The logs are there," he finally said, looking up, his face pale. "Time stamped yesterday afternoon. Red tag initiated by Henry Brown. It clearly states, root stress fracture, HPT blade 14, requires teardown." Vance closed her file folder with a sharp snap. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a cold, bureaucratic fury. "Mr. Brown, you are free to go. Do not leave the state. We will be in touch." As I walked out of the FAA office, my phone vibrated in my pocket. It was Elias. "It's a bloodbath here," the text read. "Feds just raided the supervisor's office. They took Miller's computers and boxed up every physical file in the hangar. The whole fleet is grounded pending inspection." I walked out into the morning sun, breathing in the cool, crisp air. The truth was out. The paper trail was unbreakable. Miller and Elijah had tried to bury the physics of a dying engine, and instead, they had buried themselves. 48 hours after Ship 402 tore its own engine apart on the runway, I received a courier-delivered summons to the airline's corporate headquarters. Not from operations, but from the Board of Directors' independent legal counsel. The corporate tower was a sleek, glass and steel monolith in the center of the city, a world away from the grease and noise of the maintenance hangars. I walked through the marble lobby wearing my only good suit, feeling the weight of the last 2 days settling into my shoulders. The news was everywhere. The airline stock had plummeted 20% in a single trading session. The FAA had grounded every wide-body in our fleet, pending emergency borescope inspections. A paralegal escorted me to the 42nd floor. As we walked down the hushed, carpeted hallway toward the boardroom, we passed a glass-walled conference room. Inside, looking like trapped rats in a terrarium, were Owen Miller and Elijah Hayes. They were surrounded by federal investigators and airline lawyers. Even through the soundproof glass, the panic in the room was palpable. I paused, watching the absolute destruction of their alliance. Miller was standing, his face red and slick with sweat, pointing a trembling finger at Elijah. He was talking frantically, gesturing to a printed copy of the flight release manifest on the table. I didn't need to hear the words to know exactly what he was saying. "He's the licensed A&P. He performed the blend. He signed the airworthiness certificate. Miller was trying to save himself by throwing his trainee to the federal wolves. Elijah looked completely broken. His pristine corporate uniform was rumpled, his hair unkempt, his ever-present tablet nowhere to be seen. He stared at the piece of paper on the table, the document bearing his signature, with wide, hollow eyes. He was finally realizing the cold, unforgiving reality of aviation law. Miller might have pressured him. Miller might have signed the executive variance, but it was Elijah's license on the line. He was the mechanic who had certified a broken turbine as safe to fly. Miller would face corporate ruin and intense federal scrutiny, but Elijah was looking at criminal negligence. He was going to prison. Elijah looked up and caught my eye through the glass. The arrogant fast-track engineer was gone. All that was left was a terrified 28-year-old boy who realized he had sold his entire life for a pat on the back from a boss who is now actively trying to destroy him. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I just gave him a slow, grim nod and kept walking down the hall. The main boardroom was a cavernous space dominated by a massive mahogany table. Sitting around it were the 12 members of the board of directors, the CEO, and a small army of crisis management lawyers. When I walked in, the room fell dead silent. These were people who made decisions in billions of dollars, who lobbied Congress and dined with senators. But right now, looking at me, they were terrified. The chairman of the board, a silver-haired man named Sterling, stood up and gestured to an empty leather chair at the opposite end of the table. "Mr. Brown, thank you for coming." I didn't sit down. I stood behind the chair, resting my hands on the leather back. "Why am I here, Mr. My hands on the leather back?" "Sterling?" Sterling cleared his throat, adjusting his tie. "Henry, the board has completed a preliminary review of the server logs and the NTSB's initial runway findings. It is glaringly obvious that you acted with the utmost integrity. You correctly diagnosed a catastrophic fault, and your grounding order was illegally bypassed by Owen Miller." "He didn't bypass it alone," I said, my voice cutting through the quiet room. Elijah Hayes held the grinder. "Yes," the CEO interjected, leaning forward, "which is why we are taking decisive action. Miller and Hayes are currently being handed over to the Department of Justice. The airline is cooperating fully with the federal investigation. But Henry, we are facing a crisis of unprecedented proportions. Our safety rating is in jeopardy, the FAA is breathing down our necks, and the public has lost faith in our fleet." "I'm not surprised," I said flatly. "You fostered a culture where dispatch metrics were rewarded over structural safety. Miller didn't act in a vacuum. He acted exactly how this boardroom incentivized him to act." Several board members looked down at their hands. Sterling swallowed hard. "You are right, Henry. The culture must change immediately. That is why we are asking you to return. We want to reinstate you as the senior lead technician. Full back pay, a public apology, and a substantial compensation package to reflect the distress you've endured." I looked around the room. They didn't want me back because it was the right thing to do. They wanted me back because my return was the ultimate PR shield. If the mechanic who tried to stop the disaster was put back in charge, the FAA might ease off their necks. "No," I said. Panic rippled across Sterling's face. "Henry, please, name your price." "If it's a matter of salary, it's a matter of authority," I interrupted, my voice echoing off the mahogany walls. "If I walk back onto that hangar floor as a lead tech, I still report to operations. I still report to the next Owen Miller you hire, who will inevitably try to shave hours off a turnaround to hit his quarterly bonus. I will not spend the rest of my career fighting empty suits to keep people alive." "Then what do you want?" the CEO asked, his voice tight. "I want the vice president of safety position," I said, holding his gaze. "I want it separated entirely from operations. I want veto power over any aircraft release, immune from executive override. I want a complete audit of the maintenance training program, and I want the authority to fire any mechanic, supervisor, or executive who attempts to bypass a red tag. You want my integrity to buy back your public trust? That is the price. Total, uncompromising authority over the safety of this airline." The room erupted into frantic murmurs. The lawyers leaned in, whispering fiercely to the board members. It was a complete restructuring of their corporate hierarchy. It was giving an aging floor mechanic the power to ground their entire fleet with a single signature. Sterling raised a hand, silencing the room. He looked at me, seeing the absolute, unbending resolve in my eyes. He knew I would walk out the door, and straight to the evening news if they refused. "Done," Sterling said quietly. "The position is yours, Mr. Brown." The next morning, I drove my truck back to the hangar. I didn't park on the gravel perimeter road. I parked in the designated executive spot right by the main blast doors. Clipped to my belt was a gold-plated corporate ID badge. Henry Brown. Vice President of Safety. When I pushed through the heavy metal doors, the familiar smell of hydraulic fluid and jet fuel washed over me. The hangar was packed. Word had spread, and every mechanic on shift had gathered on the floor. Off to the side, near the supervisor's office, 2 federal marshals were escorting Owen Miller and Elijah Hayes out of the building. They were in handcuffs. Miller was pale and silent, staring straight ahead, his corporate armor completely shattered. Elijah, however, stopped when he saw me. The marshals tugged on his arm, but he planted his feet for a second. He looked at my new badge, then up at my face. His eyes were red, brimming with tears of regret and terror. "Henry," Elijah choked out, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I wanted to move up. I thought I knew better." I looked at the young man, who had nearly killed 350 people for a promotion. "You forgot the first rule I taught you, Elijah. The aircraft doesn't care about your ambition. It only cares about the truth. I hope you remember that wherever you're going." I nodded to the marshals, and they let him out the doors. They were gone, permanently removed, from the industry they had poisoned. I turned back to the crowd of mechanics. Elias Bell was standing at the front, a slow, proud smile spreading across his weathered face. I walked over to him, pulled a heavy silver padlock key out of my pocket, and handed it to him. "Open my box, Elias," I said, my voice carrying across the quiet hangar. "Then pack your own. You're taking over my old spot as senior lead tech." Elias looked at the key, then up at me, his smile widening. "Yes, sir, Mr. Vice President." I turned to face the rest of the floor, the men and women who held the real power in this airline. "The metrics era is over," I announced, my voice ringing off the aluminum walls. "From this day forward, we do not work for the schedule. We do not work for the boardroom. We work for the physics of the aircraft. If you find a fault, you ground it. If management pushes back, you call me, and I will end their career. Now, let's get back to work." The hangar erupted. It wasn't polite, corporate applause. It was the deafening, echoing roar of heavy wrenches banging against steel toolboxes, a thunderous symphony of respect from the people who kept the world safely in the sky.